So, we have the true vocal folds. We have several parameters of the true vocal folds that we can modulate. And we're going to start with the vocal register, which also, as lots of the things we talked about today, could be its own lecture of 90 or more minutes. But we decided to split this spectrum of possible coordinations into 5 categories, namely pulse register, and you can hear why it's called pulse register. You might also know it as fry, but as you're going to notice, fry is being used for many sounds. So this one, to avoid confusion, we call pulse register. It's very low in the range. And then the normal speaking voice, which is not as low in the range, but the second lowest, we call chest voice. You might also know it as modal voice. We could go more into depth about what exactly defines chest voice. We're not going to do that right now. I'm just going to say it's a speaking voice. And we can also yell in our speaking voice. Hey! So this would be chest voice too. But most of the time, we have it very relaxed and low. If we go to a higher range without taking up the volume, without staying in our speech voice, we might call that a mixed voice. What is it mixing though? Chest voice and head voice. Well, this is again a very simplified explanation of what mixed voice is. And there's not one. There's just many ways to kind of give the impression that we're living in a high range with still some of the associations of chest there. If we just make it easy for ourselves and we go to the high range without taking any of the chest associations up, we have the head voice. And some people might have very hard opinions on how head voice is different from falsetto, another term that you might have heard before, but we're going to keep it simple and say chest voice, head voice, mixed voice. And then the last one, the highest one, would be the whistle register. We can change the vibratory pattern too. The vibratory pattern I'm speaking in right now is clean. If I get a bit lazy and a bit tired, you can hear a bit of creaking coming in. This is the first thing that some people would call fry, but it's not the same as the low vocal register that we call pulse. It's just, something you can do in chest voice, in head voice. And the last example I gave, it already got quite irregular. So that's a more extreme version of the same effect, creaking. If we go into the other direction, so if it's not lazy, but it actually uses a lot of air, that's what we call grunt. So that's a different type of irregular vibration. Chord closure, in the way that we use it, is going to be mostly concerned with whether the vocal folds close, and if so, how hard. It's not concerned with for how long or how quickly they close, but just, do you hear a bit of air escaping? Then they're not closing completely. That's called breathiphonation. And we could just whisper without any closure at all. If I have the opposite, very squeezed vocal folds, we call that pressed phonation. And that takes a lot of effort for very little sound. If we have a more reasonable effort for a more reasonable outcome, so enough bang for our bucks, that feels like the sound is flowing, and we call that flow phonation. We could have flow phonation in this kind of way. We could also have flow phonation in louder, more constricted sounds, but flow phonation is just referring to the pressure balance that happens if the vocal folds close in a particular way. Compression. This is a very interesting term of all of these terms because there's 1,000 things that people refer to as compression. We could refer to just the closure of the vocal folds as compression already. We could refer to the sound association we have as more compressed, but in this case, we're referring to it as this kind of thing. It's related to the Valsalva thing we talked about. The extreme form of compression we call hypercompression. And if we looked into the vocal tract, which I did, and many people before me have done, we can see the larynx is more narrowed. The false folds are more narrowed, not necessarily touching, but pressing down on the true folds so that the closure is being assisted. And we hear that as a compressed sound. If we just have closure without compression, that sounds more easy. If we have a bit of compression, like this, it sounds like I have a bit of a bellyache, but it's not the grandpa voice yet. So that's a spectrum. At least in the low range, we can also treat it like a spectrum. It's gonna get harder as we go higher. But I'm not gonna go too much into depth. Let's go to the laryngopharynx. And this is kind of a messy term because of course it exists, but it's quite a big space. And we're not really going into detail about what exact part we mean because there's different possibilities. As Marcos mentioned before, people don't really agree on what exactly twang is. Basically, we're going to talk about twang as a nasty sound. If I have no twang, my laryngopharynx is less constricted. We could have subtle twang or distinct twang. This is something we kind of copied from complete vocal technique. They call it necessary twang versus distinct twang. Necessary meaning you don't necessarily hear it, but it is there. If we look, there would be a bit of this narrowing that helps the vocal folds close, that helps certain vocal effects stay sustainable. And we're not gonna make the value judgment of whether it's necessary or not, because this is highly dependent on context and also like personal resilience, but whether it's subtle or distinct. A is distinct. A is subtle. A is no twang at all. The next three categories are supraglottic vibrations, so just means above the vocal folds. So we could have the false folds, ventricular folds, vestibular folds, vibrating irregularly, regularly, or not at all, either just being approximated or completely open. If I don't use my false folds at all, if I keep them open or passive, it sounds like this. If I approximate them more, the sound gets a bit pressed. But that's not the only sound that uses the false folds. If I do something like this, which is not pressed, the false folds are still approximating. So there's different contexts that we need them for. I'm going to try to get a nice regular example. So that was very regular. And you could hear, in comparison to which sounded more dirty, more noisy, this one almost sounded machine-like. We didn't really have noise in there, we just had an undertone, two fundamental pitches. The arytenoid cartilages, and we actually mean little bumps on top, they can either not vibrate, or they can vibrate regularly. You could hear kind of this pitch. It could be a bit lower too, like this. Or they could vibrate irregularly, and it's a bit hard to control that in isolation. But if we do that together with the true folds, so let's say, yes, that was a very good example. You could hear this machine-like sound again, but now with a different interval than my distortion. That's usually the way you can distinguish false folds and arytenoids. And then in other contexts where the vocal folds don't vibrate regularly, the arytenoids are also vibrating not in a regular way because they have no reason. And the last part is the epiglottis. You can either keep it open or retract it with the help of the tongue root, like that. So we get the Kermit the Frog sound, and you hear that in I Am Beautiful, Christina Aguilera, or Ooh, baby, when you talk like that, Shakira, and that would be the third way, going even further. I see trees, the Louis Armstrong sound, where they vibrate against the arytenoids. I think that would be a run through the vocal effects roadmap. We haven't mentioned most of the effect names yet.
The thing is, we did that on purpose, because here we are talking about ingredients and how we mix these ingredients in a bowl or something. And if we talk about whatever, butter and eggs and water, milk, something like that, we don't name it cake ingredient 2. You know, it's not just the end product yet. It's just the ingredients and how we can use them. And now we can add these ingredients and say, okay, let's pick that, let's squish this a little bit up and then put it in the oven for half an hour, and it's gonna be an awesome cake, muffin, or whatever. So this is it.